My name is Samuel Granger. I'm 56 years old, a retired civil engineer, and the last living son of Robert Granger, a man who once said, "If you listen close, land will tell you when it's being mistreated." I never truly understood those words until the spring of last year, when a war began on my family's land. Not with bullets, but with blueprints and bulldozers. Not declared by soldiers, but by signatures on paper. Let me take you back to where it all began, not in a courtroom or a construction site, but beside a quiet bend in the Willow River. Our land sat nestled between the last curve of the Willow and the tree line where the cottonwoods stretched up like cathedral columns. My grandfather had built a cabin there by hand in 1922, right after returning from France, still limping from shrapnel. The same shrapnel now rests in a rusted tin box under the floorboards of the front room. I grew up in that cabin, the youngest of 3 boys. We swam in the river every summer, fished for trout on early misty mornings, and helped our father dig out the irrigation channels that watered the 2 acres of peach trees behind the hill. It was modest land, 6.5 acres all told, but it was ours, surveyed fair and square back in the 1930s, notarized in ink that had since faded into the color of smoke. When my brothers left for the city, I stayed. Partly out of duty, partly out of stubborn love for the place. When my parents passed, first Mom in '02, then Dad in '07, the land came to me quietly and uncontested. I kept it like they did, no fences, just boundary stones, a hand-dug well, and the river. That river, it had a mind of its own. Each spring it shifted, swelling and curling in ways only the old-timers understood. One year it carried away half of our vegetable patch. Another year it left behind a dozen flat stones, perfect for skipping. But no matter what, it always returned to the shape Dad had shown it, guided by a rock weir and a sluice gate he designed when I was 10. I maintained it all, not because I had to, but because it was part of me. The rhythm of the land and river became the rhythm of my life. After retiring from the city's public works department, I spent my days cleaning irrigation ditches, repainting the shutters, talking to the trees like Dad once did. I lived quiet, ate simple, and slept with the windows open so I could hear the crickets and river's lullaby. Then one morning in March, something felt wrong. It wasn't dramatic, just a low hum in the ground. I remember stepping onto the porch with my coffee, the steam curling in the chilly air, and seeing a line of surveyor flags fluttering like red warnings across the eastern edge of my property near the clearing by the sycamore stump. They hadn't been there the day before. I followed the flags barefoot through damp grass. They cut through the land like stitches on a wound, running straight down the slope to the water's edge. About 50 yards in, I found a white stake labeled Lot 3B, Phase 1. The handwriting was sterile, corporate, as if the land wasn't living just real estate to be parsed and sold. I turned around slowly, a sinking feeling settling into my bones. At the top of the hill, just beyond the fence line, I'd helped Dad fix so many times, stood a trailer with a temporary sign, Willow Glen Community Development Project, Future Site 35 Luxury Homes. The air tightened in my chest. I don't remember walking back to the cabin. I just remember sitting on the porch steps, staring at my hands, calloused and dirt-stained, wondering how 35 houses could rise on land I'd mowed, weeded, and worshipped for decades. No one had contacted me. No official letters. No notice taped to my door. Nothing. Over the next week, trucks came. Chainsaws buzzed. Trees fell. Concrete stakes pounded into earth. And still, no one knocked. It wasn't until I stopped one of the workers, a young man in a neon vest named Tyler, that I learned the truth, or at least part of it. "Oh yeah," he said, flipping through his clipboard. These lots were approved by the HOA's expansion initiative. Karen Whitmore signed off last quarter. Said the land was classified as Community Overflow Riverfront Retention Zone, I think. I stared at him. What? He raised an eyebrow. Willow Glen, the subdivision on the other side of the ridge. I felt something twist in my gut. That subdivision had been built just 3 years earlier. Neat rows of beige houses with plastic mailboxes and identical porches. I'd heard about it, even waved to a few of the new families who hiked past my road. But I never imagined they had any say in what happened on this land. Tyler pointed to a printed map on his clipboard. Yeah, see. The expanded property line follows the new hydrological redistricting. It includes this zone here. He tapped the corner of my land. You're on the fringe. Probably zoned as utility or shared space. I took the map and studied it. Sure enough, my land was labeled Sector E, green buffer highlighted in pale blue. But it was wrong. I knew the topography. I knew the elevation levels. I knew where the original boundary stones were buried beneath the grass. And I knew one more thing, that my father's hand-drawn survey from 1964 showed a completely different line, one that never crossed the riverbank. But who was going to believe that a wrinkled map in a tin box? A man in flannel jeans versus an HOA with attorneys. Still something inside me stirred. The land was whispering again. Not in words, but in ache. The sycamore stump where I first carved my name with Dad. The wild irises that only bloomed in April. The waterline etched into stone like a birthmark. I stood there that day watching machines roll over topsoil older than me, and I thought, they don't know what they're building on. And they didn't. Because the Willow wasn't just a river. It was memory boundary and witness. And if no one else would speak up, if the courts refused, if the HOA ignored, if the maps were erased, then maybe it was time to let the river speak for itself. The letter came 4 days later, folded crisp in a plain white envelope, no return address. Just my name written in stiff block letters, and the HOA's logo, 2 overlapping willow leaves forming a smug little circle. It was taped to the side of my mailbox with blue painter's tape, like they were afraid to touch my property any more than necessary. I didn't even notice it until late in the afternoon, when I was hauling firewood to the side shed, and the wind caught its corner. I stood in the driveway, hands sticky with sap, and stared at it for a long minute before peeling it loose. The envelope had weight to it. That kind of weight legal papers have thick, glossy stock, unnecessary and menacing. I opened it with the back of my pocket knife. Inside were 4 pages. The first bore the heading, Notice of Adjoining Property Modification and Community Integration. Agreement. I read that title twice. Then again. My heart sank before my eyes reached the second line. They were informing me, not asking, informing, that due to a recently approved amendment by the Willow Glen HOA Development Board and supported by a unanimous vote from its Architectural Control Committee, a portion of the land historically and colloquially associated with my parcel had been reclassified as Shared Natural Access and Green Buffer Zone. In short, they claimed part of my land no longer belonged to me. They cited City Code 17.8240, an obscure clause about communal drainage easements, and a hydrological study conducted in accordance with Phase 2 expansion requirements that justified modifying local boundaries for the purpose of flood control, aesthetic consistency, and public utility. Effective immediately, the letter read, Sector E will undergo infrastructural transition. All existing obstructions or unapproved landscape features within the revised boundaries will be assessed and, if necessary, removed to ensure conformity with HOA development goals. The last line was the knife. We appreciate your cooperation as we integrate your area into a safer, more beautiful Willow Glen. There was no signature, just the title Karen Whitmore, President, Willow Glen Homeowners Association. I stood by the mailbox long after the sun dipped behind the ridge. I wasn't even angry at first. Not really. Just confused. Hollow. As if something sacred had been translated into a different language and handed back to me like I should be grateful. The next morning I went straight to City Records. I hadn't been there in years last time, was to file Mom's death certificate and have the deed updated to reflect sole ownership. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes and a dragon tattoo curling up his neck, was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Granger, but the parcel map for your property does show recent amendments. This is the updated boundary line." He spun the monitor toward me. On it, the property I had known all my life was cut clean, 2 full acres on the eastern slope, now shaded in soft HOA beige. "That's not right," I said quietly. "Where's the old version from before the expansion vote?" He clicked a few keys. "We only keep digital records now. Anything older than 2005 is scanned, but not all images are archived properly. Can I request a physical review?" He hesitated. "You can file a request, sure, but it'll take 4 to 6 weeks, maybe longer with the backlog. Do you have any idea how many years this land's been ours?" I asked, tapping the screen. "This line right here cuts through my irrigation trench. The river never crossed that point, not once in 50 years. "I believe you, sir," he said genuinely. "But unless it's recorded in the current plat maps or registered surveys, it doesn't count in court." And there it was again. The knife under the paper. I left with nothing. Back home, I walked the boundary stones. Dad and I placed them in 1979, one by one, using a compass and a thick iron rod we hammered into the clay. Some of them still stood moss-covered, barely visible. Others had vanished under brush. But I knew where they were. My body remembered every foot of that border. Later that week, I went to one of the new construction sites to speak to whoever was in charge. That's where I met Karen Whitmore in person. She stood next to a black SUV clipboard in one hand, white visor perched high on her forehead, like a general inspecting her troops. She was in her early 50s, rail thin, wearing a red HOA polo, tucked into khaki pants, without a wrinkle in sight. I approached her slowly. "Excuse me," I said. "I think we need to talk." She turned with a practiced smile. "Can I help you, sir? I own the land just across the clearing. Some of these lots," I pointed to the new concrete pads cut into my property. "There's been a mistake." "Oh," she said, already sighing. "Mr. Granger, is it?" I nodded. "Yes, we received your voicemail." I was meaning to respond. "Unfortunately, your concerns were reviewed last month and addressed by our legal team. Everything here," she gestured around, like a hostess showing off her garden, "has been approved." "By who?" She flipped through her clipboard. "City Zoning, Phase 2, Development HOA Committee vote. We even had a biologist review environmental impact. All green lights. That doesn't change the fact that this was never community land." "Mr. Granger," she said sweetly, "I understand this must be hard. But land rights aren't emotional, they're factual. If you feel you have a case, you're welcome to take it up with municipal court. But be advised, our lawyers are very experienced in these matters." She smiled again, wider this time, like she was doing me a favor by not laughing. I took a breath. "So you're just going to pave over family history because someone missed a file in a drawer?" "Progress is painful," she said, "but inevitable." I walked away that day with something I hadn't felt since my father's funeral, powerless. For weeks after, the hammering never stopped. Trucks came and went. Cement was poured. Sod laid. Mailboxes drilled into fresh concrete that once held our watermelon vines. My land, my trees, my ditch, they vanished under square plots, with lot numbers and for sale signs. Neighbors from the other side of the ridge passed by, waving like it was just another pretty expansion. They had no idea. But I knew. I felt it in my chest, like the river was turning cold. I spent nights sitting on the porch, staring at the bend of the willow, listening to the faint growl of machines, and wondering how much longer I could stand it. And then one evening, while clearing out the shed to look for old boundary posts, I found it. A rolled-up canvas tube, dusty and cracked. Inside, my father's original hand-drawn plat map, dated 1964, marked in thick pencil and red ink. It showed every corner, every rise and fall, and most importantly, a boundary line that stopped 30 feet before the first new foundation slab. I ran my fingers over the paper, trembling. It wasn't just a map. It was proof. The land had spoken through my father's hand, and I intended to let it speak again. I arrived at the HOA office just after 9 on a Wednesday morning. The building was as artificial as the community it presided over, beige stucco, with faux brick trim, plastic flower beds, framing a sign that read, Willow Glen Community Life Center, in cheerful serif font. Inside it smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender air freshener, the kind meant to simulate peace while delivering the opposite. There was a receptionist behind a polished desk. Young, smiling, wearing the same red polo Karen wore the day I met her on site. "I have a meeting with Mrs. Whitmore," I said. "Karen." She looked down at her schedule, clicking her mouse exactly 3 times before replying. "Ah, yes, Mr. Granger. You're listed under Community Outreach. Conference Room C. She'll be with you shortly." I nodded once and walked down the hall past framed photos of neighborhood events, barbecues, kids on scooters, ribbon cuttings, and into a cold, windowless room with glass walls and one long table in the center. No warmth, no plants, just function and surveillance. Karen entered 5 minutes later, holding her tablet like a shield. She didn't sit. "Mr. Granger," she said, not looking up, "I understand you've raised additional concerns about parcel boundaries." I met her eyes. "That's putting it lightly." She sighed, finally sitting across from me, folding her hands in that practiced political way. "As I mentioned previously, all property updates have gone through the proper channels. Your grievances have already been reviewed by zoning." I brought something I said and pulled the map from its protective tube. She didn't lean forward, didn't blink. I unrolled it gently on the table, smoothing it with care. The canvas was aged but clear. My father's handwriting curved across the edge in black ink, and the borders were marked with red lines and notes that matched topographical data from the 1960s. "This is the original survey," I told her. "Drawn by my father, a certified civil engineer. Notarized. These lines reflect the official boundary registered with the county before digital plat systems ever existed." Karen tilted her head. "I'm afraid unofficial family documentation, no matter how sentimental, doesn't override legal zoning." "This isn't sentimental," I said, my voice sharper than intended. "This is legally valid. I checked the state archival laws. As long as it's not been superseded by a properly filed resurvey and no deed transfer has occurred, the original remains enforceable." She gave a brief, dry smile. "You seem very passionate about your land, Mr. Granger. But these decisions weren't made overnight. This expansion has been planned for 2 years, voted on, approved by City Council. We have met every legal requirement. Then how did you get approval to build on floodplain without a variance?" That made her pause. I saw her expression shift ever so slightly, like a hairline crack forming in a glass mask. "I've been working in civil engineering for over 30 years," I continued. "That land sits on a river-fed slope with seasonal saturation. Your Phase 2 homes. They're built within 50 feet of an old water channel. I helped my father reinforce the bank myself." She exhaled, stood, and walked to the wall, staring at her own reflection in the glass. "There's always resistance," she murmured almost to herself. "We're offering people opportunity, safety, community, but there's always someone who clings to old definitions of ownership." Old definitions, I stood too. "You're paving over memory, over history. And you're doing it with fake maps and fast permits." She turned suddenly. "No," she snapped. "We're doing it with votes, with structure. You had every chance to attend the expansion hearings, every chance to file an objection. But you didn't, did you?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I hadn't. No one told me. No letter, no notice. Nothing in the mail or on my door. I had assumed, like most older landowners, that the land I lived on, paid taxes for, and tended with my own 2 hands, was secure unless I signed it away. Karen stepped closer. "You may be right about the survey," she said, quieter now. "But it doesn't matter. By the time any appeal winds its way through court, the homes will be sold, the families moved in. You'll be the man who stopped progress. You'll be the headline people mock." "I don't care," I said. Her mouth tightened. "We do." She pressed a button on her tablet. A moment later, the receptionist entered with a folded sheet of paper and handed it to me. Karen didn't even look as I opened it. It was a cease and desist order accusing me of trespassing on HOA property and interfering with contracted development. "This isn't over," I said quietly. "No," she replied, picking up her tablet. "It's already finished. You're just late to the ending." She walked out before I could say another word. I stood alone in that glass room for a long time, staring at the cease and desist in my hands. Not angry. Not even afraid. Resolved. Because if she truly believed it was over, then she didn't understand the river. The willow had never been silent. It had only been waiting. And deep inside me, something began to wake. That evening, I walked the eastern edge of my land, with a lantern searching for the original rock markers Dad and I placed half a century ago. Some had sunk, others had cracked. But I found them one by one, buried beneath roots and time. Each one a heartbeat from the past, echoing into the present. And when I reached the river's edge, I saw it again. The slope, the runoff channel, the half-buried pipe from our old water redirection system. Forgotten, ignored. But still there. I knelt by the pipe, pressed my hand to the damp earth, and whispered, "They don't know what you can do." The next morning, I climbed into the attic and pulled out Dad's blueprints. Not just the map, but the entire water system. Sluice gates, overflows, underground channels. He'd designed it to protect the land, to direct seasonal floods into natural basins so nothing washed away. But what if I reversed it? What if I simply let the river move as it once had, not sabotage, not revenge, just restoration? Let the water speak, let the land breathe, let the river decide. The attic hadn't changed in years. Dust hung like mist in the slanted sunlight, pouring through the vent slats, and the scent of cedar and old paper hit me with the force of memory. I climbed carefully, feeling the familiar creak of the third step, the one Dad always said he'd fix, and never did. The plywood floor was littered with boxes, some full of worn tools, others packed with holiday lights, fading photos, and hand-labeled jars of nails. But I wasn't here for sentiment. I was looking for the blueprints. Dad had drawn them after the flood of '67. That spring, the Willow River had jumped its banks during the snowmelt and washed out the eastern orchard. It took him a full summer, a dozen notebooks, and 2 broken wheelbarrows, but by fall he'd built a network of stone-lined channels and a gravity-fed sluice gate system that redirected excess flow into a natural basin farther downhill. He told me once, a man who listens to the land doesn't fight it. He dances with it. I remembered helping him dig the overflow trench by hand, my palms blistered and my face sunburned, too young to understand the why. All I knew was that Dad wasn't building for today. He was building for 50 years from now. I found the blueprint tube near the back wall, tucked behind a crate of canning jars. The lid cracked when I opened it. Inside, the plans were yellowed and curled but intact. I spread them on the attic floor with reverence, my breath catching at the neat, confident lines of his pen. Every slope, every contour, every measurement was there. And more importantly, so was the proof. A notation in the corner marked the original boundary lines confirmed by the 1964 survey. A dotted line labeled Overflow Retention Zone, private cut precisely through what was now the foundation for Lot 7 of the Willow Glen expansion. And a small but critical diagram showed the location of the sluice gate, a concrete valve buried beneath the ridge fed by a spring-fed reservoir that hadn't run dry in my lifetime. I traced the line with my finger. If opened, it would send thousands of gallons of water downhill, not in a torrent, but steadily, relentlessly, restoring the old channel, the one the HOA ignored when they poured concrete on top of clay. This wasn't sabotage. It was history asserting itself. And it was legal. I spent the next 2 days walking the property, cross-referencing the map with what still existed on the land. The old iron valve wheel was exactly where I remembered, rusted and half-buried beneath ivy at the base of a mossy retaining wall near the tree line. It took an hour to clear it with a crowbar, and gloves another 2 to lubricate it with penetrating oil until it moved. Every turn of that wheel felt like resurrecting my father. Every groan of metal echoed like a heartbeat. When the gate finally cracked open, the water whispered through, slow and cold. It smelled like stone and root, ancient and patient. I left it ajar, just enough to restore the natural slope, not enough to cause damage. Not yet. That night, I sat on the porch with the blueprints in my lap and watched the construction lights blink across the hill. I sipped black coffee and listened to the wind slide through the willows, brushing the air like a warning. They were still pouring concrete, still building dreams on a foundation that did not belong to them. I could hear the laughter of the new homeowners echo from the model homes across the ridge. Young couples walking through hollow skeletons of future kitchens, wide-eyed kids chasing one another between piles of drywall and pine beams. And I felt it again, that ache in my chest. This wasn't just about me. It was about every quiet person who'd ever been told their land didn't matter. Every widow whose backyard had been claimed by a fence. Every veteran whose driveway had been reclassified as common access. Every man who held up a deed and was laughed out of a room because the ink was older than the bylaws. The next morning, I took the blueprints to the county records office again. This time, I requested a formal submission for historical survey documentation under Ordinance 21.3b, a little-known statute that allowed for legacy surveys to be introduced as supplemental evidence in property disputes if the original property lines predated municipal zoning districts. The clerk, a woman named Nadine who looked like she'd survived more than one bureaucratic war, raised her eyebrows when I showed her the plans. "You're serious?" she said. "Very." She leaned in, studying the boundary notes. "You know this might rattle some cages, Mr. Granger." I'm counting on it. I filled out the paperwork, signed the affidavits, and left a copy of the plat map stamped and sealed. It would take 10 business days, they told me, for the petition to be reviewed. Maybe longer. I didn't have 10 days, because the rain had started to fall. Soft at first, like fingertips tapping on the tin roof of my porch. Then harder. The kind of spring rain that churns the river like muscle and memory. The ground swelled. The air smelled of turned soil and broken bark, and I knew it was time. That night, I opened the gate fully. I didn't do it in secret. I didn't hide. I left the lantern burning beside the old sluice house just as my father had when he first tested the system back in '68. The water surged with a deep, satisfied breath, cascading down the hill, curling around the roots of forgotten trees, slicing through the old trench, like it had never stopped flowing. The next morning, the construction site was ankle-deep in mud. By noon, it was a bog. Lot 7 sank first, the foundation pooling with standing water. Then Lot 6. Then Lot 8. The fresh sod curled like burned parchment. A newly delivered porta-john tipped sideways and floated down the path like a warning buoy. Karen showed up around 4. I saw her standing at the edge of the site, in a red windbreaker, clutching a clipboard even in the rain. She barked into her phone, waving furiously at the contractors, her voice rising over the roar of sump pumps and the splash of workers dragging plywood to build makeshift walkways. I didn't go down there. I stayed on my porch, holding a cup of tea, watching from a distance as nature rewrote the lines they'd drawn. The river had decided, but I wasn't finished yet. I filed the injunction the next day. It wasn't a grand gesture. No media, no banners. Just a worn briefcase, a single printed petition, and a cold cup of coffee trembling in my hand as I stood in line at the county courthouse. The clerk at the filing window barely looked up as she took the stack of papers and stamped the first page with a mechanical clunk that echoed like a rifle shot in the sterile hallway. Case number 4226H, she said, handing me a receipt. You'll be notified of a preliminary hearing date within 10 business days. Next. I stepped aside. That was it. Months of watching the land be taken, weeks of sleepless nights, hours of researching floodplain codes and legacy property rights, all compressed into a stack of pages and a rubber stamp. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still bruised. I walked to my truck feeling strangely untethered, as if something should have happened immediately. An apology, a news crew, a bolt of divine lightning. But the world kept turning. That afternoon, I got a call from the HOA's legal counsel, a man named Wesley Trask. He sounded young, probably no older than 30, full of polite arrogance. "Mr. Granger," he began, "I've been informed of your recent petition. While we respect your right to pursue legal clarification, I must advise that any attempt to redirect water flow, alter grade elevations, or interfere with ongoing HOA construction could be construed as environmental endangerment." "I haven't altered anything," I replied. "I've reopened a historical channel that predates your HOA's founding. Nonetheless, any resulting damage to HOA property may be prosecuted. We urge you to reconsider your course of action. Litigation can be prolonged and expensive." He paused, waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. "We're prepared to offer a resolution," he continued. "If you agree to retract your petition and cease all interference, the HOA will approve a goodwill payout of $25,000 for the easement rights. You retain your cabin and western acreage, and we maintain community cohesion." It was all very measured, all very clean. They wanted me to sign away history for a check. "Tell Karen," I said quietly, "the river says no." Then I hung up. 2 days later, a court letter arrived. My hearing had been scheduled for 43 days from now. Nearly 7 weeks. Plenty of time for them to finish construction, sell the homes, pour more concrete, and drown the evidence in bureaucracy. I took the letter to the porch and sat in my father's old rocker, holding the paper in both hands like a fragile leaf. I didn't cry. Not right away. But as the wind picked up and the first yellow petals of the wild irises scattered across the yard, I felt something crumble inside. Not rage, not defeat. Just a kind of exhausted sorrow I didn't have words for. This wasn't just a legal fight. It was a slow erasure, the kind you don't notice until it's too late. One ordinance, one vote, one cement truck at a time, and suddenly the trees you planted are behind someone else's privacy fence. That night I didn't sleep. I walked the riverbank with a lantern watching the water slide around the edges of the field. It had begun to shift course, already widening the trench, saturating the soil, beneath Lot 6 and 7. But it wasn't violent. It was patient. Just like my father had designed it. Just like I would need to be. The next morning I made copies of the blueprints and mailed them certified to the local paper, the Environmental Review Board, and the mayor's office. I included a brief note in each envelope. These are the original records of the land now under dispute. They were never reviewed during HOA rezoning. They show construction on an active waterway. You may ignore this, but the river won't. I didn't expect responses, but I needed the truth to leave my hands. I needed it in the world somewhere beyond their filing cabinets and court delays. For a few days, nothing happened. Then came the drone. It buzzed over my roof early one morning like a mechanical hornet dipping low over the willow trees and hovering above the sluice gate. I watched it from this porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. It circled 3 times, then rose like a vulture and vanished over the ridge. That afternoon, Karen showed up. No warning, no pretense. She pulled into my gravel drive in her black SUV and stepped out wearing mirrored sunglasses and heels wholly unsuited for the mud. She didn't knock, just marched around the side of the house and found me in the orchard pruning what remained of the peach trees. "You've made your point," she said, removing her glasses. I didn't answer. "This will cost everyone, not just you. Do you understand that families are already in contract? There are loan agreements, investors, children expecting to start school here in August." "And what about me?" I said, still clipping the deadwood. "What do I tell the roots of these trees, the boundary stones in the soil, the water that refuses to obey your spreadsheets?" "You're romanticizing dirt," she snapped. "You're sabotaging progress." "No," I said, looking up at her. "I'm honoring truth." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're going to lose Sam. Maybe not today, but eventually. The courts move slow and we have the permits. The buyers don't care about survey maps drawn by someone's grandfather. They want Wi-Fi and granite countertops, and they're willing to overlook a little water in the basement if the HOA tells them it's normal." I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned on the spade. "Then maybe they deserve what's coming." She flinched. For the first time I saw it doubt. A flicker of it behind her confidence. Because she knew. Deep down she knew they'd built on soil that remembers, on land that wasn't finished speaking. She left without another word. That night the river rose again, a slow, steady breath. It hadn't flooded. Not yet. But the banks grew soft, the earth greedy for return. I stood in the rain, with a lantern, watching reflections ripple through the trench, like secrets rising from the past. I remembered my father standing just like this, boots in the mud, arms crossed, whispering something I didn't understand back then. Water never forgets. I didn't sleep. Instead, I wrote. I wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper. I told my story not as a warning, but as a confession. a man who failed to protect what was given to him, a man who watched the old ways fade and realized too late that silence was complicity. I ended it with a single line: "If they won't listen to me, let them listen to the river," and I mailed it. The court date was still 37 kilometers away. The homes were still rising. But something had shifted. Not in the law, not in the HOA, in the land. Because when I stood near the old trench the next morning, I saw the water glistening higher than it should have been. The roots of a newly planted fence post were exposed. A concrete pad was cracking along the corner. And a trench, just a faint one, had begun to form across Lot 8, carving its way back to where the willow used to run. The land was remembering. The river was returning. It had been nearly 4 decades since I last stood at the stone weir my father built. Nestled beneath the shadow of 2 ancient cottonwoods, it was little more than a crescent-shaped formation of river rock and sandbags reinforced with timber, humble in appearance but brilliant in function. This was where Dad had redirected the willow's overflow, coaxing the river with patience rather than forcing it with steel and cement. I remembered the first time we tested it. I was 18, all muscle and rebellion, certain I knew better than any man who wore suspenders and talked to trees. He'd asked me to dig out the feeder trench one afternoon, and I'd half-assed it, frustrated that my friends were out cruising the main strip in town while I was elbow-deep in silt. That night, the trench flooded. The next morning, I found Dad already there, kneeling beside the breach, smiling without a trace of anger. "This land doesn't punish," he told me. "It just teaches. And it teaches in water." Now standing there again, older than he ever lived to be, I could feel the full weight of that lesson pressing against my chest. The water lapped softly against the stones, murmuring through crevices, glinting beneath the pale gray of the March sky. It wasn't a flood yet, not even close. But it was shifting slowly with purpose. The channel we'd carved decades ago had begun to reopen on its own, not through force but through memory, like the land remembered its own shape. I crouched at the weir and reached into the cold current, feeling the familiar groove in the stones, where Dad had smoothed the edges with his hammer and file. I brushed away algae and sediment, clearing a small pathway, and watched as the water slipped through, eager and sure. A hawk called in the distance. The wind smelled of ironwood and wet soil, and something in me settled. This wasn't vengeance. This was a return. That afternoon, I drove into town and visited the historical archives at the county library. I signed the logbook and requested the original land plat microfilms from 1933, 1941, and 1964. The clerk, an older man named Vince with a thick white beard and hands that shook, brought them with a small smile. "Granger," he said, "I knew your dad. Helped him catalog some of these back when the city tried to expand zoning eastward in '89. He beat them back with little more than a compass and a handshake." I chuckled. "He'd hate what's happening now." Vince nodded. "Then it's up to you, isn't it?" He helped me load the reels onto the microfilm machine. And there they were, the original hand-annotated boundaries, recorded before any HOA even existed. I printed copies of everything, marked plots, surveyed easements, notes in the margins about floodplain expectations. But most importantly, a 1941 hydrological overlay showing the Willow River's historic path across what is now Willow Glen Phase 2. The natural channel cut through what had become Lot 7, 8, and 9 homes currently under construction, basements freshly poured. I left the library with a manila folder thick enough to silence doubt. By the time I returned home, 3 more homes had been framed. The skeletal wood beams stood awkwardly in the morning light, like trespassers trying to act natural. I stood at the tree line and counted them, my jaw tight. The ground beneath them glistened with water. A light mist hovered across the east field, and the sound of sump pumps hummed from behind the portables the contractors had set up as temporary offices. But no one had stopped building. That night, the rain came again, slow and relentless, the kind that seeps into everything. I sat by the weir with a flashlight, watching the flow double in volume. The trenches filled. The willow trees swayed in rhythm. At 3 a.m., I heard the first crack. It came from the far side of the ridge. I threw on my coat boots, crunching through wet soil, and followed the sound through the dark. Lot 9's retaining wall had split. A hairline fracture had grown into a gash, and water had begun to seep through the base of the foundation. The soil was softening, the gravel support undermined. A crew of night workers scrambled with flashlights, stacking sandbags, yelling into walkie-talkies. I stood just outside the yellow caution tape and watched. Karen arrived 30 minutes later in a silver raincoat, mud splattered across her heels. She saw me and bristled, then marched over with 2 security officers in tow. "You're trespassing," she said flatly. "I'm on my property," I replied. "This is still my side of the line." She gestured to the collapsing wall behind her. "Your actions have endangered a residential zone." "My actions?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean opening a historical channel that existed before your HOA did? You built on a floodplain. I just removed the plug. You'll be held accountable. So will gravity." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You think this is some righteous mission, that you're a hero of mud and moss," I think I said. "Stepping closer, that you and your developers ignored every warning sign because you thought a line on a map was more powerful than a current under the soil." She said nothing, just stared. And then the wind shifted, and with it the sharp, unmistakable scent of rising groundwater, the kind that carries sediment, the kind that speaks of landslides. One of the workers yelled something urgent. Another slipped in the muck. Karen turned without another word and walked briskly back toward her SUV. The next day, I received a court notice. The HOA had filed a temporary restraining order against me alleging intentional environmental manipulation, interference with development, and malicious destabilization of construction zones. I was ordered to appear before a judge within 72 hours. But by then, the damage was done. Lot 8's foundation had begun to buckle. Lot 7 had a visible lean. Photos taken by a local resident. Photos I hadn't requested circulated online. Water pooling beneath rebar. Cracks zigzagging through poured cement. A trench yawning like an old scar across the property line. And alongside those photos, someone had uploaded my father's blueprint. It went viral. The headline read, "They built on history, now the river remembers." Within hours, journalists called. Then the local NPR station. Then a university hydrologist asking if he could tour the property. I gave no statements. I answered no calls. I simply sat by the river and listened. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived early. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table flanked by 3 lawyers. Her jaw was set, her blouse pristine, but her eyes darted often to the gallery, to her papers, to the sealed evidence folders she clearly hadn't opened. The judge, a tired-looking man named Halberd, read through the preliminary briefs, then asked a single question. "Mr. Granger, do you acknowledge altering the flow of the Willow River?" I stood. "No, Your Honor. I restored its original path documented in county records from 1941-1964 and confirmed by current conditions. The HOA's construction violated floodplain zoning and ignored geological precedent. I acted to protect my land. The river did the rest." Judge Halberd looked down at his copy of the blueprints, then over at the printed satellite images submitted by the university professor. He sighed. Then he said, "Case dismissed pending further civil review. All parties are instructed to cease development until environmental assessment is complete. I didn't smile. Karen didn't speak. The land had spoken. And for the first time in months, I walked out of that courthouse not as a man accused, but as a man heard. The night after the hearing, the air was thick with fog. It clung to the branches like breath on glass curled along the river's edge and softened the world into a dreamscape. I sat on a wooden stool by the fire pit, wrapped in my father's old army blanket, a thermos of black coffee resting on my knee. Every now and then, I sipped and listened, really listened to the sounds the land made when it thought no one was watching. The river wasn't raging. It didn't have to. It whispered, surged, pulsed, resolute and indifferent, like a heart too old to race but too strong to stop. The new trench we'd carved decades ago had widened naturally, eating away at the slope, dragging fresh rivulets back toward the original floodplain. The trees, once choked by construction dust, now swayed freely in the damp wind. For the first time in months, I felt peace. But it didn't last. At around midnight, a pair of headlights cut through the mist. They moved slowly down the gravel path near the south fence line, Karen's SUV. I stayed in my seat, unmoving. She parked a few yards away, climbed out, and approached with cautious steps. She wasn't wearing her HOA uniform this time. No clipboard, no heels, just jeans, boots, and a dark rain jacket zipped to her chin. I raised an eyebrow. Late for a surprise inspection. She didn't smile. I'm not here to argue. I motioned toward the extra camp stool near the fire. Then sit. She did. The silence between us lasted minutes. The river gurgled nearby. A coyote howled faintly in the woods. I read the full blueprints, she said, eventually, her voice low. Your father was meticulous. He listened. She nodded. You were right. About the floodplain. About the soil. The civil engineers we hired didn't do their homework. They cut corners. And we let them because we were chasing deadlines. I didn't respond. She pulled out a folded document from her jacket, slightly damp at the corners. It was the construction halt order from the County Environmental Board signed that afternoon. Lots 7 through 11 are suspended indefinitely, she said, and will probably lose insurance coverage for the eastern build entirely. The HOA board is panicking. Investors are threatening to walk. Still, I said nothing. She looked at me, then really looked. You've won, Sam. There was no victory, I murmured. Only survival. She inhaled deeply, then added, There's going to be a vote to remove me as HOA president next week. I turned my head. You surprised? No. Just tired. And for the first time, Karen looked less like a villain and more like a person, cracked, fraying human. We sat in silence a while longer. Then I asked, why come here? She hesitated. Because you're the only one who ever made me feel like I was on the wrong side of something sacred. That caught me off guard. She stood, brushing off her hands. The board's lawyers will still try to delay your claim. But without the homes finished, you have leverage. And with public opinion shifting. She trailed off. I stood too, walking her back to her SUV. At the door, she turned. Do you still believe the river's making the decisions? I looked past her toward the dark gleam of the willow curling beneath the mist. I believe it remembers what we forget. She didn't say goodbye, just got in and drove off, her tires cracking softly against the wet gravel until the lights disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I walked the property lines by lantern, checking the old boundary stones. Each one was now visible, cleared by water, illuminated by moonlight, moss wiped clean by the recent runoff. It was like the land itself had drawn its own outline. I followed it to the sluice gate, still open and whispering. I tightened the wheel one full turn, not to shut it, just to slow the flow. Balance, not destruction. Restoration, not vengeance. As I walked back to the cabin, I passed the edge of Lot 9. The frame still stood soaked and crooked, but untouched by any crew for days now. A small sign had been driven into the ground. Construction delayed, environmental review pending. Behind it, the foundation sagged in the center like a sunken rib cage. In the morning, I made my decision. I packed 3 folders, one with the legacy survey maps, one with court documents and cease and desist notices, and one with satellite images showing water displacement over the past 2 months. Then I drove into town to meet Marlene, a real estate attorney I'd known for years. We met at a diner just off Main Street, sitting in a corner booth by the window. I laid the folders between us and said I want to file for permanent protective designation of the riverbank and eastern acreage. She blinked. As what a private conservation easement. If I can't stop them legally, I can make it biologically untouchable. They won't be able to mow the grass without permission. Marlene leaned back, whistled. You really want to tie it up like that? No, I said. I want it left alone. Forever. She opened the folders, flipping slowly. You've got enough. The Environmental Board's ruling gives you precedent. Public support's strong. Might take time, but it's doable. I nodded. And the rest of the land, she asked. I'll rebuild the orchards, restore the slope, and maybe... I paused, build a footpath where people can walk and read about what this place used to be. Who lived here? What it meant. She smiled softly. A living memory. Exactly. That evening, I returned home to find an envelope on my porch, handwritten this time, sealed in wax. Inside was a note from Tyler, the young construction worker who first showed me the lot map. Mr. Granger, I quit the project last week. Thought you should know. I watched what they did to your land. I saw the cracks before the mud came. You were right. If you ever need help rebuilding the trench or planting trees, I'm around. Tyler. I folded the note and placed it beside my father's blueprint on the mantel. Outside, the sky was clear. The willow shimmered in the moonlight, no longer roaring, just breathing. And for the first time in what felt like years, I let myself believe that the land would outlast the paper, that roots went deeper than concrete, that the quiet things had power. I poured a final cup of coffee, stepped outside, and whispered to the trees. We're not finished. Not by a long shot. It started with a drone clip. A neighbor's son, 14 years old, armed with a Christmas gift, and too much curiosity, had flown his drone over the ridge one morning and captured the full view, a panorama of chaos. Houses half-built and sinking into mud. Heavy equipment stuck axle-deep in flooded trenches. The willow curling through the eastern lots like a serpent reclaiming its coils. His father, Mark Kepler, posted it to the town's Facebook group with a caption that read, "Maybe we should have let the land speak before we built over its lungs." It exploded. Within hours, the footage had been reposted by local journalists, then regional outlets, then a national news site specializing in environmental reporting. Headlines poured in like spring runoff, the river that sued back homeowner fights, HOA, with flood maps and winds, concrete dreams. Meet muddy reality in Willow Glen. My phone rang non-stop. I ignored most of them. I hadn't done this for fame. I hadn't even planned it as a battle, let alone a spectacle. But the media loves a good David and Goliath story. And when you add mud drones and a cranky old man with boundary stones and blueprints, you've got a narrative the internet can sink its teeth into. Karen didn't take it well. I first saw the video late one night. Someone had filmed her on a construction site, pacing furiously in her red raincoat, heels squelching in mud as she shouted at contractors and camera crews. "Shut that off. You don't have permission to be here. That man has manipulated this land. He's orchestrated this disaster. It's not the river, it's him." She was flushed, wild-eyed, her tightly controlled demeanor cracking under the weight of national scrutiny. Behind her, a backhoe operator stood motionless, arms crossed, clearly done with the whole affair. The video cut off as Karen turned and kicked a mud-clogged traffic cone. It had over 200,000 views by morning. The next day, a crew from a major news network requested an interview. They wanted to film me standing by the willow, speaking about legacy preservation and justice. I declined. Instead, I handed them copies of my father's blueprints, my official court filings, and the environmental assessment that had just come back, confirming that the HOA had indeed failed to file proper wetland impact reports. I told them, let the documents talk. The river already said everything else. They published a full segment. And just like that, the narrative shifted. No longer was I a stubborn holdout clinging to sentimental land. I was a steward, a protector, the son of a man who listened to the earth before he listened to profit. And Karen, she became the face of overreach. The public turned. Residents of Willow Glen began attending HOA meetings en masse, questioning budget allocations, permit approvals, and why so many decisions had been made behind closed doors. A petition to dissolve the current board gained traction, backed by homeowners tired of fines for mailbox colors, while the entire eastern edge of their neighborhood collapsed into waterlogged shame. 3 days later, I was summoned to a community forum at the Willow Glen Clubhouse. I hadn't set foot in there since it was built. The room was packed, folding chairs filled with young couples, retirees, teenagers with phones recording from every angle. I stood at the back, flanked by reporters, my name whispered like a legend. Karen was on stage, flanked by the remaining board members, visibly trying to maintain control. "This forum," she began, "is not a trial. It's an opportunity for clarity, for healing. The HOA acted within its legal bounds." A voice cut her off. "Did you build homes on protected land?" Karen stiffened. "We followed the zoning guidance provided." A murmur rippled. Someone else asked, "Why didn't you hold a public vote on the Phase 2 expansion?" Another. "Why did you ignore the hydrological survey?" Her voice grew strained, defensive. The answers grew thinner, shakier. She pointed toward me at one point, saying, "This man weaponized water." I didn't move. I didn't have to. The crowd laughed, not cruelly, but with the soft realization that her grasp had slipped. The forum ended early, drowned in noise. Karen stormed off stage, her red folder clutched like a lifeline, eyes blazing, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. 2 nights later, I heard tires on gravel again. I stepped outside expecting more reporters, or maybe Tyler dropping by with seedlings like he'd promised. Instead, I saw Karen's SUV. She stood beside it alone, arms crossed, not dressed for a confrontation. No clipboard, no script. "Off the record," she said. I nodded, motioned for her to speak. "I'm stepping down." I said nothing. "I'll take the hit publicly. The board wants it. Investors want it. But the narrative they're saying, I ignored science, that I bullied you, that I nearly caused a flood." "You did." She flinched. "You could say something. Help soften this. Tell them I meant well." I stared at her, then quietly replied, "The river doesn't soften for anyone." She exhaled sharply, turned back to her car, then stopped. "I lost everything in this, Sam." "No," I said gently. "You finally saw what you never had." She didn't respond. She left without another word. The HOA board dissolved itself a week later. New elections were called. The Phase 2 homes were canceled. The entire eastern acreage was reclassified as a protected watershed under county ordinance. A local conservancy group offered funding to build walking trails and post-historical signage, including one dedicated to my father and the original river map. I agreed. And with that, the willow returned to silence. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of endurance. It didn't take long for the dominoes to fall. After the HOA board's resignation, the county launched a formal investigation into the zoning approvals tied to Willow Glen's Phase 2 development. It turned out my case wasn't isolated. It was the most visible, but not the only one. At least 5 other homeowners came forward claiming their lots had been quietly redistricted without full disclosure. Some were paying elevated HOA fees for riverfront privileges on land that had once been part of my family's floodplain. Others had purchased under the belief that their homes were in a no-risk zone, only to discover that recent rainfall had flooded their basements. A class action suit began forming before my court case was even closed. City council members issued statements. The mayor called for a joint task force to review irregularities in municipal and HOA cooperation protocols. But to the people who lived in Willow Glen, those who had been fined for leaving out trash cans or planting unapproved shrubs, these statements were just noise. They wanted justice, and it came in slow, steady waves. Karen's resignation didn't stop the consequences. A local news station aired an exposé, a 10-minute investigative segment titled Power Permits and Property Lines Inside Willow Glen's Wettest Mistake. It detailed the tangled relationship between HOA board members and a regional construction firm, Drake Wilson Holdings, which had received fast-tracked approvals for multiple builds in the area. It also uncovered a critical document, a conflict of interest disclosure form, that Karen had failed to submit. Her husband, as it turned out, was a silent partner in Drake Wilson, a fact that, when revealed, sent shockwaves through the county's Developer Oversight Committee. 2 weeks later, the district attorney announced an inquiry into potential fraud and abuse of zoning authority. I kept quiet. No press conferences, no interviews. When asked for comment, I referred them to the court documents and the river itself. I had no interest in revenge, but I did want accountability, and the court provided that in the best way it could. On a gray Thursday morning in April, I returned to the same courthouse where my petition had been filed. This time, not to defend my actions, but to finalize the ruling. Judge Halberd presided again. The chamber was full, neighbors, lawyers, reporters, and a small group of Willow Glen residents who had until recently viewed me as the grumpy loner at the edge of the subdivision. Now they nodded in recognition as I walked in. Mr. Granger, the judge, began adjusting his glasses. This court has reviewed all supplemental documentation, environmental impact reports, and original survey data submitted on your behalf. It has also received sworn testimony from city engineers and hydrologists confirming the historical validity of your property lines. He paused, glanced at Karen's vacant defense seat. It is the court's finding that your land was and remains privately owned, that the Phase 2 development infringed upon protected watershed areas, and that your restoration of the Willow River's natural channel was both appropriate and lawful. He looked at me. You were right to act. This community owes its preservation to your persistence. With a crack of the gavel, it was done. The ruling carried real weight. The entire eastern slope of Willow Glen was designated as non-developable land, permanently protected as a hydrological and historical preservation zone. All construction east of the 1964 boundary line was ordered removed within 90 days at the developer's expense. I was granted formal recognition as the primary steward of the protected area, with discretionary rights to maintain, restore, and educate. No fines, no retaliation, just recognition and release. That afternoon, I drove home in silence. It had rained that morning. The willow glistened in soft golden light. The trenches were full but calm, the roots of the willow trees drinking deeply. I walked the land barefoot like I used to as a boy, and felt the cool earth between my toes. At the edge of the eastern slope where Lot 9 had once stood, there was now a puddle the size of a living room bird's skimming the surface. The house frame had already been dismantled, trucked away like a mistake no one wanted to admit. I stood there listening to the breeze move through the cottonwoods. Then quietly, a woman stepped into the clearing. It was Emily Rowe, a teacher, mother of two, and the new interim president of the HOA. She held a folder and looked both nervous and hopeful. "Mr. Granger," she said, "may I speak with you?" I nodded, gestured for her to join me under the willow tree. "We've voted to dissolve the HOA," she said plainly. I blinked. "Completely." She nodded. 74% of homeowners signed the petition. "We're switching to a voluntary neighborhood association. No fines. No enforcement authority. Just shared gardening days and maybe an annual picnic." She handed me the folder. Inside were signatures, bylaws, and the county's acknowledgement of the change. "I wanted you to have the first copy," she said, "because none of this would have happened if you hadn't stood your ground." I looked down at the paper, and for the first time since this began, I smiled. That weekend, something miraculous happened. Not in court, not in law, but in the earth. A pair of deer returned to the edge of the river. One doe, one fawn, cautious, wide-eyed, stepping through the reeds where bulldozers had once parked. They drank silently while I sat on the porch and watched. Behind them, children played along the newly marked footpath. The community, now freed from control, had come together to build it themselves. Wooden planks and rope rails leading through the trees with plaques detailing the history of the land. They even asked me to write the text for one. This land was not given freely. It was defended by silence, by memory, by water. Listen, and you might still hear it. And people did. They came in small groups, walking slowly, pointing at the old rock weir, asking about the hand-dug channels. I told them stories of Dad, of shovels, and blueprints of the day the river returned. I never raised my voice. I didn't have to. In the months that followed, the land healed. The wild irises bloomed again. The cottonwoods thickened. And on the far edge of the property, Tyler and I began planting a new orchard, peach trees, like the ones my father used to favor. Each sapling bore a small wooden tag with the year etched in hand-carved script. 2025. A year of remembrance. A year of reclamation. A year the river chose. On the final day of the construction removal, I stood alone at the top of the hill, watching as the last truck rumbled away. The soil beneath Lot 8 had already begun to sprout. Grass would return, so would birdsong. And me, I remained. Not as a holdout, not as a fighter, but as a keeper. A listener, a son who remembered. Spring melted into summer, and the willow flowed slower, warmer, its edges no longer hard with resistance, but wide and generous like a deep breath after a long cry. Life returned in ways I didn't expect. I'd always thought this land would die with me, that once I was gone, the developers would swoop in with concrete and clipboards and tear down what my father had spent a lifetime nurturing. But the opposite happened. It wasn't just preserved, it flourished. Children now played beneath the willow groves, chasing frogs and skipping stones just as I had when I was their age. Retirees brought lawn chairs and sketch pads to the riverbank. Teachers led small classes down the new nature trail, reading out loud from signs I helped write. One even held a watercolor workshop by the weir painting, the way the light hit the water as it curled through the rocks. The cabin, once silent and stubborn in its solitude, became part of the landscape's story. People stopped by not to trespass, but to listen. They'd knock gently, ask questions, sometimes bring pie or coffee. Some brought their parents, older folks who remembered the orchard in the 70s, who had bought fruit from my mother's wooden roadside stand. And I told them everything. Not for pity, not for pride, but because this is what memory becomes when it's shared, not a scar, but a root. One morning near the end of June, I stood at the foot of the old sluice gate and realized something profound. I no longer needed to defend the land. It was defending itself. The county had officially listed the entire eastern slope as a historical environmental preservation site with dual designation for indigenous recognition. Turns out the willow had been considered sacred long before any of us lived here. The Conservancy group placed a carved stone at the trailhead inscribed with 3 words, "Let the river speak." And speak it did. Not with thunder, not with destruction, but with quiet. The kind that can only be heard by those who stop long enough to listen. On July 3rd, exactly 1 year after I found that first surveyor flag fluttering near the stump, I held a small gathering under the cottonwoods. No speeches, no fireworks, just neighbors, friends, former adversaries, and people who had read about the story in the paper or seen it online. They brought picnic baskets and blankets. Someone played acoustic guitar. A little girl asked if she could plant a tree in memory of her grandfather. I handed her a peach sapling and a shovel. We dug together. When it was planted, she named it Truth. No one clapped. No one needed to. We all just stood around it, letting the wind say what needed saying. Later that evening, Tyler and I walked the boundary line. He was older now, not in years, but in posture, in presence. After leaving the construction firm, he'd gone back to school to study environmental design. Said he wanted to build things that breathe instead of break. I believed him. As we reached the river's bend, he turned to me. "You know they'll write books about this one day, right?" I smiled. "Let them write. Just don't let them pave." We both laughed, then sat on a flat stone where my father and I once sketched the first outline of the trench. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Not selling. Not settling." I shook my head. No. Because this land didn't need saving. It just needed someone to listen long enough to remember what it already was. That night I sat on the porch with a mug of chamomile, the crickets loud, the air thick with honeysuckle. I thought about everything, the court hearings, the mud, the betrayal, the drone videos, Karen's red face, the boys' drone, the old maps. I thought about my father, about his calloused hands and quiet strength. And most of all, I thought about that moment in the courthouse when I stood alone, shaking, with nothing but paper and memory to defend me. I had let the river decide, and it had spoken with the slow certainty of truth. Now every morning I rise before the sun. I walk the path from my porch to the edge of the willow. I touch the bark of the same tree my father carved his initials into. I feel the water with my fingertips. I listen. Sometimes the river murmurs. Sometimes it sings. Sometimes it says nothing at all. But every day it reminds me this isn't a story of revenge. It's a story of return. Because power isn't found in a gavel or a threat. It's found in stillness, in standing firm when the tide comes, in knowing your roots run deeper than blueprints, in watching a whole world try to build over you and refusing to disappear. So I stayed, and I listened, and the river patient and wild did the rest.